Russia were driven by a complex interplay of ideological, political and economic factors which led to shifts between cousin cooperation and often bitter superpower rivalry over the years. After Cold War, the U.S.-Russia relations have changed dramatically with two collapses. The first collapse was the fall of Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. Both two countries had to adjust their foreign policy to deal with the new war context. The second collapse took place on September 11, 2001. The two nations have reset their relationships on the basis of cooperation against terrorism. In this video clip, we will analyze the American use of force in relation with Russia post-Cold War.
Anyone trying to cross its 29-mile length. But in 1989, a wave of popular unrest unleashed by the liberalizing reforms of Glasnost and Perestroika under Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev led to the collapse of the communist regime.
In Bill Clinton's administration, he emphasized the promotion of democracy inside Russia and did not hesitate to use American power and resources to do so.
In June 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin officially visited the U.S., remarking the warmth up in their relation.
Mr. William
Hard not to feel dramatic irony at work here today. Bill Clinton's been in New York giving his State of the World speech to the United Nations General Assembly, stressing the need for the superpower to support poorer nations, yes, including Russia.
We have sought to help former adversaries, like Russia and China, become prosperous, stable members of the world community.
The U.S. provided economic aid for Russia after the devaluation of Russian ruble in 1998. In return, Russia was not allowed to sell weapons to India and Syria. Therefore, the U.S., as a neo-realist actor, wanted to slow down the recovery of Russia.
To strike military and security targets in Iraq. They are joined by British forces. Their mission is to attack Iraq's nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs and its military capacity to threaten its neighbors. Their purpose is to protect the national interest of the United States and indeed the interests of people throughout the Middle East and around the world. Saddam Hussein must not be allowed to threaten his neighbors or the world with nuclear arms, poison gas, or biological weapons.
My fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo. Last fall, our diplomacy, backed by the threat of force from our NATO alliance, stopped the fighting for a while and rescued tens of thousands of people from freezing and starvation in the hills where they had fled to save their lives. And last month, with our allies and Russia, we proposed a peace agreement to end the fighting for good. The Kosovar leaders signed that agreement last week. Even though it does not give them all they want, even though their people were still being savaged, they saw that a just peace is better than a long and unwinnable war.
The first bombing of its kind in NATO history. On March 24, 1999, Western nations carried out their threat against Serbia and began the biggest military conflict on Serbian soil since World War II. NATO saw the war as the only way to end President Slobodan Milosevic's violent crackdown in Kosovo, where his Serb nationalist forces were accused of ethnic cleansing against Kosovo's largely Muslim ethnic Albanian population. But what began as an attack on military targets soon expanded. Schools, monuments, homes, and even the Chinese embassy were hit. At the end of the campaign, 11 weeks later, Human Rights Watch estimates around 500 civilians were killed.
Then and now, I think it was a great mistake by NATO.
Chechen rebels. He said Russia is still a great power with a full arsenal of nuclear weapons. In Washington, Mr. Clinton responded.
You know, I didn't think he'd forgotten America was a great power, but he didn't in Kosovo.
Is it the real harmony of the West and Russia in the very first period post-Cold War?